It started like any other night, a quiet evening, the hum of televisions and the glow of smartphones. But at 9:47 p.m., everything changed. Across every screen, no matter the channel or app, the broadcast cut to static. Then, the voice came, robotic, cold, and emotionless. It spoke only a few chilling words. This is an emergency broadcast. Prepare for the blackout. Protect yourselves and stay indoors. It begins now. People froze in disbelief. Was it a prank? A hack? No one could say, but something about the tone, the weight in its delivery felt wrong, deeply wrong. On social media, panic spread like wildfire. Hashtags like #TheBlackout and #StayInside trended instantly. People began sharing stories of strange happenings, flickering lights, sudden power surges, and shadowy figures glimpsed in the corners of their vision. Some claimed they heard whispers, faint but insistent, calling their names. Meanwhile, the warning message repeated ever. Then, without warning, the lights in entire neighborhoods began to fail one by one. Darkness crept across the city like a living thing, swallowing everything in its path. The air grew heavy with silence, as if the world. The first sign of something unnatural came long before the city was plunged into complete darkness. At first, it was small things, a flicker of a street lamp, a TV shutting off for a moment before coming back on. People brushed it off as a glitch or power surge. But then the occurrences grew stranger. In one house, a family watched as their ceiling fan slowed to a stop, even though the switch was still on. In another, a man swore he saw his kitchen clock spinning backward at an impossible speed. Something was wrong. By the time the sun had set, these anomalies had spread everywhere. Car alarms blared in unison before abruptly falling silent. Refrigerators hummed loudly, then stopped altogether. The air itself seemed charged with something unseen, something alive. In the heart of the city, reports of bizarre phenomena flooded local radio stations. A commuter described seeing streetlights in the distance flicker in sequence, almost as if something invisible was walking beneath them. Another caller, their voice trembling, claimed their phone screen had suddenly displayed a single word, run. And then at precisely 10 p.m., it happened. The blackout began. It wasn't a slow process, nor was it limited to a few areas. In an instant, the city was engulfed in total darkness. Phones, flashlights, even car headlights failed to pierce the suffocating void. People stumbled, shouted, and reached for one another in the blackness, unaware that they weren't alone. Somewhere in the distance, a deep, guttural sound echoed, a sound no human throat could produce. The first sign had been ignored. Now it was too late. As the blackout consumed the city, the world fell into an eerie, unnatural silence. No hum of electricity, no chatter of televisions or radios, just stillness. But then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, they echoed through the streets, cutting through the void. At first, people thought it was just someone trying to find their way in the dark. But as the sound grew closer, it became clear that no ordinary human could produce such bone-rattling weight with each step. A group of friends, huddled in a darkened apartment, peeked out from behind the curtains. The faint light of the moon cast long shadows on the empty street below. Then they saw it, a figure, tall and possibly thin, and moving with an unnatural, jerking gait. Its limbs seemed too long for its body, bending in ways that defied anatomy. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening for something or someone. The friends froze, their breaths caught in their throats, as the figure stopped beneath the flickering remains of a street lamp. One of them gasped, and the figure's head snapped upward, as if it had heard. It didn't have eyes, not in the way humans do, but its face, if it could even be called that, seemed to emanate a piercing awareness. Then it moved, faster than should have been possible, its legs folding and stretching like a grotesque spider. It vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the echo of its footsteps and the faint, metallic smell of something unrecognizable. By the time the friends regained their composure, they realized one of them was gone. Their friend's phone lay on the floor. The screen cracked, but the camera still recording. The last image captured was a glimpse of the figure's hand, elongated, skeletal, and reaching out. The city was silent, except for the occasional, distant scream. But in the suffocating darkness, the sounds began to emerge. soft at first, then growing louder, more deliberate. It started with faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing, like voices carried by the wind. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Some people tried to convince themselves it was just their imagination, but deep down they knew better. The whispers weren't random, they were speaking names. Their names. In one neighborhood, a woman clutched her flashlight, its beam flickering in her trembling hands. The whispers grew louder, circling her home like a predator stalking prey. Then came the thudding, heavy footsteps on her roof. She barely had time to react before her dog began barking furiously, its sound sharp and panicked. The barking cut off suddenly, followed by a sickening crunch. Trembling, she backed into the corner of her living room, phone in hand, as the footsteps descended from the roof and moved toward her front door. The knob rattled, then stopped. Silence. Then a voice impossibly low and guttural spoke from just outside, "Let me in." Elsewhere, families huddled together in their homes as more sounds erupted, scraping metal, like claws dragging against steel, distant cries, growing louder before abruptly cutting off, and an odd, rhythmic clicking sound that no one could place. Some reported hearing distorted laughter, mechanical and inhuman, echoing through the streets. And always after the sounds came the feeling of being watched, an oppressive sensation, as though unseen eyes were fixed on them from every angle. What made it worse was that no one could see what was making the sounds. Shadows danced on walls, objects shifted on their own. But whatever was out there refused to be seen, until it wanted to be. For those unlucky enough to catch a glimpse, it was already too late. Amidst the darkness, a strange phenomenon began to unfold. Tiny bursts of light appeared in the city, sporadic, faint, and eerily rhythmic. At first, they seemed like electrical surges, the kind that might signal the return of power. But the patterns were too deliberate, too precise. Lights flickered in windows along alleyways, and even in the sky, forming shapes that some began to interpret as messages. It was as though the blackout was more than just a loss of power. It was a canvas for something far more sinister. In a suburban street, a father stared out his window at the odd flickers. His family, huddled behind him, whispered nervously as the lights outside blinked on and off in what appeared to be a deliberate sequence. The man's curiosity overcame his fear, and he began jotting down the pattern. 3 flashes, a pause, 2 flashes, another pause, then a single, longer burst of light. He thought it might be Morse code or a distress signal, but as he worked through the sequence, his face turned pale. "It's not a code," he muttered. "It's coordinates." Across the city, similar lights began to appear, but each in a different sequence. Some formed unsettling shapes when viewed from high above, circles, spirals, even grotesque outlines of humanoid figures. Those who dared to follow the lights found themselves inexplicably drawn toward specific locations: abandoned warehouses, empty parks, and crumbling buildings. The places seemed random, yet connected, as if the lights were guiding them to the heart of something far darker. And then came the whispers again, louder this time, synchronized with the flickering lights. "Come closer," they urged. "See what lies within the dark." Those who followed the lights often didn't return. For the ones who did, their eyes were wild with terror, their minds fractured. They spoke of glimpses of something they couldn't describe, something watching them from the edges of the light. The puzzle remained unsolved, but one thing became clear. The lights weren't leading anyone to safety. They were lures, drawing people into the darkness, to a place where the mysterious figure waited. The lights weren't the only things acting strangely. As the city sank deeper into chaos, objects began to shift, quietly at first, then more violently. Chairs slid across rooms, doors slammed shut without warning, and furniture rearranged itself in impossible ways. It was as if the darkness itself had a will, toying with the people trapped within it. Nothing stayed where it was supposed to, and every movement seemed deliberate, calculated, almost malicious. In one apartment, a young couple tried to barricade themselves inside. They dragged their dining table against the door, piled chairs on top of it, and stacked boxes in front of every window. Exhausted, they sat in silence, clutching each other tightly. But then the sounds began, a low creak, followed by the unmistakable scraping of wood against the floor. They turned in horror to see the table they had pushed against the door slowly sliding away. Chairs toppled over as if pulled by an invisible hand. Desperate, the man rushed to hold it in place, only for it to be yanked from his grip with unnatural force. Elsewhere in the city, stories circulated of objects behaving with eerie precision. A woman described waking up to find all her mirrors turned to face her bed. A man returned to his living room to see his family photographs arranged in a perfect circle on the floor, their glass frame shattered. In another home, a group of friends fled after discovering every knife in the kitchen stabbed into the walls, spelling out a single word: welcome. People tried to explain it away: earthquakes, drafts, even hallucinations. But deep down, everyone knew these weren't coincidences. The objects moved with purpose, as if responding to unseen commands. And the more they moved, the clearer it became. The force behind them wasn't random. It was watching, waiting, and slowly closing in. The first to disappear were the ones who tried to speak out. Neighbors, friends, and family members who claimed to have seen something strange, something they couldn't explain, vanished without a trace. At first, their absences were written off as people fleeing the chaos. But as the pattern emerged, it became clear. The more someone knew, the more likely they were to disappear. In one particularly chilling case, a local radio host decided to broadcast the stories pouring in from across the city. He invited callers to share their experiences live on air, creating a lifeline for those trapped in their homes. One caller, her voice trembling, described seeing the figure standing at the end of her street, staring at her window. "It wasn't human," she whispered. "It looked like it was waiting." The line went dead mid-sentence. Moments later, the host himself fell silent. Listeners heard the sound of his chair scraping back, followed by faint, muffled footsteps. The broadcast ended abruptly, replaced by static. Across the city, others disappeared in equally unsettling ways. A young man who had been live streaming the blackout on social media suddenly stopped responding. His last post was a cryptic video of his room, lights flickering, shadows stretching across the walls, before the screen went black. His followers were left staring at a single chilling message that appeared in the chat: "He's here." The missing left no clues, no signs of struggle. Doors remained locked, windows unbroken. In many cases, their belongings were left untouched, as if they had simply ceased to exist. But those who stayed behind knew the truth. The whispers, the lights, the moving objects, these weren't random occurrences. They were warnings. And those who ignored them were taken, one, by the thing lurking in the darkness. As the city descended deeper into the chaos of the blackout, chilling messages began to appear. They were scrawled on walls, etched into fogged-up mirrors, or burned into wooden surfaces as though by an unseen hand. The words were brief but haunting, each one designed to strike at the core of those who found them. Some were warnings, others seemed like taunts, but all carried the same ominous tone. In one home, a young woman stumbled into her kitchen after hearing a noise. The light from her phone illuminated her refrigerator, where the words, "You're next," were smeared in what looked like soot. Her hands shook as she tried to rub it away, but the writing wouldn't budge. Terrified, she retreated to her bedroom, only to find another message waiting for her on her mirror: "I see you." Elsewhere, a group of neighbors tried to make sense of the messages appearing on the walls of their apartment building. Each time they erased one, a new phrase would show up in its place, often more disturbing than the last. "Don't run," one read. "It's already too late," said another. One by one, the group began to disappear, leaving only their hastily scribbled notes behind. The messages weren't limited to homes. In the streets, graffiti-like scrawlings began to appear, glowing faintly in the darkness. They formed riddles, names, and cryptic commands that no one could explain. One message appeared repeatedly in different parts of the city, etched into sidewalks, walls, and even the sides of vehicles. He is here. Each message carried a palpable weight, as though the words themselves were alive, watching. People began to fear what would happen if they didn't heed the warnings. But no matter where they went or how far they ran, the messages always seemed to find them. And with every new appearance, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the sense of dread more overwhelming. As the blackout stretched into its second night, all paths seemed to lead to the heart of the city. The strange lights, the cryptic messages, and even the whispers, everything pointed toward the abandoned plaza downtown. For those brave or desperate enough to follow, what they found there defied explanation. The plaza, once a bustling space of life and movement, was now eerily empty, save for a faint, pulsating glow emanating from its center. At first, it seemed like just a trick of the eye. Shapes moved in the dim light, shadows circling as if caught in a macabre dance. But the closer people got, the clearer it became. These weren't mere shadows. They were figures, translucent and shifting, forming a perfect ring around the source of the glow. They moved in unison, their heads bowed and arms raised, as though performing a ritual older than time itself. A witness, trembling and barely able to speak, later recounted what they saw. They weren't human, not anymore. Their faces were blurred, like smudges of darkness. And their voices, they didn't speak, but I heard them in my head, like screaming whispers. At the center of the ritual stood a towering monolith, blacker than the surrounding night and seemingly alive. It pulsed with an energy that felt like dread itself, emanating a deep, bone-chilling hum. One by one, the circling figures began to vanish, melting into the darkness as though absorbed by the monolith. Then, for a brief, terrifying moment, the glow intensified, illuminating the city in a vivid purple light. Those who saw it described horrific shapes within the glow, forms twisting and writhing, too grotesque for the mind to comprehend. And then, just as suddenly, the light vanished, plunging the city back into suffocating darkness. Those who had approached the plaza were never seen again. Only the faint hum of the monolith remained, echoing across the empty streets, as though it were waiting for more. As whispers of the plaza's horror spread, a handful of survivors sought answers. Among them was an old journalist, a man who had spent decades digging into the city's hidden past. Convinced the blackout and the mysterious figure were more than random events, he began piecing together fragments of forgotten history. What he uncovered would chill him to the core. Deep in the archives of the city library, buried beneath decades of dust, he found records of a similar event. It had happened over a century ago, in 1913, when the city was little more than a growing settlement. Back then, the blackout wasn't caused by technology failing. It was described as an unnatural darkness, swallowing the land whole. Reports from the time spoke of a figure of shadow and bone walking the streets, of people disappearing without a trace, and of strange symbols carved into the earth where they were last seen. The most disturbing discovery came in a series of letters from the town's mayor, written days before his own disappearance. "The thing in the dark is no stranger," one letter read. "It is ancient, a remnant of something we should never have awakened. It does not simply come, it is called." The words sent shivers down the journalist's spine. Called? By who or by what? Digging deeper, he unearthed an ominous detail. The monolith in the city center had existed for far longer than the city itself. Early settlers had tried to destroy it, but every attempt failed. Over time, it was buried, forgotten, until now. The journalist realized the blackout wasn't random. It was part of a ritual, one designed to bring forth the figure in the darkness. But who had initiated it this time? And why? Armed with this knowledge, The journalist rushed to warn the remaining survivors. But as he stepped into the cold night air, he froze. In the distance, past the flickering lights and shifting shadows, he saw the figure. It was watching him, waiting, and he knew with a sinking dread that the truth he'd uncovered had sealed his fate. As the second night of the blackout dragged on, those who remained clung desperately to whatever sources of light and sanity they could find. But the radios, silent for hours, suddenly crackled to life. At first, it was just static, sharp and grating, filling the air with unease. Then, amidst the noise, a voice began to emerge. It wasn't human, low, guttural, and distorted. The voice sounded as if it was speaking from another plane entirely. It spoke in a language no one could understand, its tone cold and deliberate. But as the message repeated, words began to form, words that everyone, no matter their language, could hear clearly. "You cannot escape," it growled. "The light will not save you. The dark is forever." Across the city, survivors froze as the message played in unison, no matter the device. Old radios, smartphones, even speakers that had been disconnected echoed the same haunting words. The voice carried a strange power, one that left those who heard it paralyzed with fear. And then came the laughter, a twisted, mechanical sound that reverberated like nails on metal, growing louder and louder until it was unbearable. Suddenly, the voice addressed individuals directly. A woman screamed as her name was spoken, as though the figure itself was calling her out. A man dropped his flashlight, shaking uncontrollably as the voice described his exact location. In the corner by the broken lamp, it hissed, "I see you." And just as abruptly as it began, the transmission ended. But the silence that followed was worse. People scrambled to turn off their devices, terrified the voice might return. For many, it did. In the dead of night, their phones and radios flickered back to life, not with static, but with the faint sound of breathing, deep, ragged, and far too close. By morning, the city would find that the message wasn't just a warning. It was a promise, and it had already begun to come true. As the third night of the blackout loomed, hope began to fade. The streets were empty, the homes abandoned or eerily quiet, and the whispers had grown louder, more insistent. Then, without warning, the power returned. Lights flickered back on, illuminating the city in sudden, jarring brightness. Relief swept through those who had survived. Brief, fleeting relief. But something wasn't right. The city felt different. The streets, once familiar, seemed slightly altered. Buildings appeared taller, their angles sharper, as if the darkness had warped them. Windows that once faced the sun now reflected nothing but blackness. It wasn't just the architecture. The air felt colder, heavier, and the silence, though no longer absolute, was deeper, more oppressive. It was as if the city had been hollowed out, its very essence consumed by whatever had come during the blackout. And then there were the people, or the lack of them. Entire families were gone, their homes left in disarray, as if they had fled mid-meal or mid-conversation. In some places, eerie remnants of their presence remained. Steaming cups of coffee, unfinished board games, even clothes left folded neatly on beds. But the people were nowhere to be found. For those who had survived, the true horror lay in what had been left behind. Scattered across the city were strange symbols burned into the ground, resembling those described in the lost records. And in the heart of the city, at the plaza where the monolith had stood, a new symbol now pulsed with faint light, as if alive. No one dared approach it. The final blow came when the survivors tried to contact the outside world. Phones worked, televisions broadcast their regular programming, and the internet appeared functional, but no one answered. Messages, calls, emails, all went unanswered. It was as if the city had been cut off, sealed in a bubble of unnatural quiet. And in that quiet, one undeniable truth began to sink in. They weren't alone. From the corners of their vision, they could see them, shadows that didn't belong, flickering just out of reach. Shapes moved in the distance, silent but deliberate. At night, the whispers returned, louder than ever, echoing through the city like a macabre song. And above it all, a deep, resonant hum could be heard, coming from nowhere and everywhere. The lights had returned, yes, but they had brought something back with them. Something that wasn't going to leave.